All right, welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving into something pretty intense. We're unpacking a highly theoretical, incredibly detailed intelligence briefing called The Architecture of American Fracture and Constitutional Restoration. Now, I want to set the ground rules right up front. The stuff in this text is heavy. It models a hypothetical, modern-day collapse of the United States. We're absolutely not here to take sides, endorse any viewpoints, or get dragged into political debates. Our goal today is strictly analytical. We're going to objectively map out exactly how this author models the domestic collapse and the strategic moves they claim would follow. So if you appreciate breaking down grand strategy frameworks without all the emotional noise, you are definitely in the right place.
Okay, let's jump right in. Here's our roadmap. We'll start with the modern fracture scenario, move into the external threat matrix, look at the urban-rural gridlock, break down ideology and balkanization, and wrap up with the loyalist stabilization doctrine.
Section 1. The modern fracture scenario, beyond the 1860s myth.
Right off the bat, to really grasp this framework, the text argues you have to completely toss out those old cinematic tropes of the 1860s Civil War. We are not talking about two distinct standing armies wearing colored uniforms, marching across state lines in a clean conventional war. No way. Instead, the author argues America would shatter into a volatile patchwork of competing zones through something strategists call low-intensity asymmetric balkanization. What does that mean? Basically, it's a hyper-fragmented conflict defined by institutional balkanization, where local and state entities just openly defy federal mandates, and permanent gray zone warfare. So think chronic infrastructure sabotage rather than conventional battlefield shootouts.
The author uses this realpolitik method called systemic stress testing, which is essentially running worst-case simulations on our existing infrastructure to put some numbers on this. Through this testing, they estimate the chances of an overt, synchronized, kinetic hot war, a total 1860-style collapse, at a remarkably low 10 to 15%. Why? Because it's literally economically suicidal. Red and blue states rely on the exact same interstate electrical grids, financial clearinghouses, and food supply chains. You can't just slice that down the middle. However, the likelihood of asymmetric balkanization, that's rated much higher, up to 50% under severe crisis conditions. The state wouldn't totally dissolve, it would just fragment into highly defended urban sanctuaries, loyalist blockades, and pretty lawless supply corridors.
Section 2. The External Threat Matrix. Superpower Interdiction.
Now, in a state of unrestricted warfare, global rivals aren't just going to sit on the sidelines with some popcorn, right? They see a domestic crisis inside a global hegemon as the ultimate strategic jackpot. The text actually models exactly how non-state and state actors would transform localized unrest into an international proxy war. First up, transnational cartels at the southern border. They'd exploit the vacuum left by paralyzed federal forces, executing sovereign land grabs and flooding radical domestic factions with asymmetric weapons. Next, China. The model suggests they would leverage cyber and financial vectors, bankrolling domestic sabotage by funding radical vanguard groups and launching zero-day cyber attacks on city infrastructure. Finally, Russia. They would dominate the information space, using AI-driven bot farms for cognitive sabotage. We're talking manufacturing deepfakes to engineer false flag friction, basically tricking opposing domestic factions into fighting each other.
The real takeaway here is this concept of horizontal intervention. Adversaries aren't going to launch a conventional military strike from the outside. That's way too risky against a nuclear power. Instead, they just pour resources, intelligence, and weapons directly into America's existing domestic fracture lines. By doing that, they ensure the superpower bleeds out internally, leaving it completely removed from the global geopolitical board. It's basically a strategy of letting the target defeat itself.
Section 3. The urban and rural gridlock. The geometry of the siege.
This is where it gets really fascinating. The author argues that the nation is structurally polarized, and geography totally dictates who holds the cards in a crisis. Think about it. Major metropolitan centers? The model describes them as isolated islands. They don't actually produce their own internal resources. They rely entirely on continuous high-volume import pipelines for food, water, and power. Think about how fast grocery store shelves empty out during just a bad snowstorm. That's the fragility the author is highlighting. Conversely, the rural interior holds what the text calls a resource veto. Rural counties literally sit right on top of the physical infrastructure, the energy grids, the agriculture, and the highway bottlenecks. In a collapse, rural factions wouldn't even need to invade the cities. They could execute a passive structural veto just by shutting off the supply lines, which the author claims would trigger a municipal collapse within 72 hours.
There's a quote from the briefing that hits the nail on the head. In a hot civil collapse, the physical geometry of the land rules the board. When you really unpack that, what it means is that political affiliation effectively stops being about voting and transforms into a hard, unforgiving geographic boundary. Survival just becomes a matter of where you are standing and what resources that specific piece of dirt controls.
And this geographic divide, it instantly triggers a massive command fracture within law enforcement and the military. The text models a devastating dual sovereignty crisis that just splits the armed state apparatus right down the middle. Conservative governors would instantly assert absolute sovereign control over their national guards, flat out refusing federalization. Within the states themselves, command fractures even further. You'd have urban municipal police co-opted by city executives, while rural county sheriffs structurally aligned with constitutional loyalists. This isn't just bureaucratic red tape. We're talking about heavily armed entities operating under completely contradictory legal orders. Ultimately, the framework assigns a decisive tactical overmatch to the loyalist interior. Why? Because demographically, they house the vast majority of the nation's military veterans, specialized engineers, and, an estimated 400 million privately owned firearms.
Section 4. Ideology and Balkanization, Spiritual Mobilization and Demographics.
Now the framework shifts from hard physical resources to the psychological battlefield. It treats ideology and religion as active, tactical tools. The model depicts a really stark clash between traditional faith networks and secular vanguards. For the loyalist interior, traditional Christian networks serve as these organic staging grounds. They already have massive physical footprints, established communication lines, and crucial high internal trust, everything you need to become decentralized civil defense hubs. On the flip side, secular urban vanguards view these exact religious institutions as the ultimate obstacle to their ideological goals. The text models that radical cells would actively target religious infrastructure, using cyber-sabotage or physical blockades to try and shatter the cohesion of the interior.
The clinical breakdown of how major cities might theoretically balkanize is, pretty sobering. The author claims that, fueled by foreign AI bot farms manufacturing hyperpolarized racial friction, civic trust just entirely evaporates. Cities rapidly fracture into self-defending ethno-geographic enclaves. We're talking street-level gangs setting up armed checkpoints just to control localized food and fuel distribution. Simultaneously, the text points to the rise of isolated sectarian strongholds, citing areas like Dearborn, Michigan, where parallel legal codes such as Sharia would completely replace failing municipal law. They'd basically function as autonomous zones operating entirely within the United States.
But here is a massive distinction the author makes. The loyalist interior totally sidesteps this racial balkanization. Instead of fragmenting along identity lines, the text models a huge, multiracial loyalist coalition. This group, made up of diverse veterans, business owners, and professionals, unites not around race, but around shared principles, legal neutrality, and constitutional capitalism. They anchor their identity in traditional American heritage, which the author argues gives them unassailable operational discipline. Because they aren't fighting internally over identity politics, they maintain a unified, highly effective command structure.
Section 5. The Loyalist Stabilization Doctrine, Reclaiming the Baseline.
So, how would they actually try to fix it? Let's examine the theoretical operational framework loyalists would use to restore order from the inside out. The text lays out 4 exact tactical steps. Step 1. Establish localized joint task forces. This means merging civilian volunteers with professional state security forces to maintain a legal chain of command. Step 2. Deploy decentralized mesh communications. Think high-frequency amateur radio and encrypted satellite lines to completely bypass digital blackouts. Step 3. Secure energy and agricultural lifelines, protecting that crucial rural resource veto. And finally, Step 4. Execute localized pacification blockades. Rather than launching high-risk conventional invasions into dense balkanized cities, loyalist forces would just establish strict outer containment blockades. It's a passive, structural starvation of radical zones, basically just waiting for them to capitulate to constitutional authority.
I want to highlight the actual endgame stated in this grand strategy model. The quote reads, "The ultimate objective is not total destruction of their adversaries, but the systemic restoration of the rule of law and civilizational equilibrium." According to the framework, the Loyalist Vanguard's mission isn't anarchy or revenge. It's systematically neutralizing subversion to reclaim the constitutional republic, reopen interstate commerce, and bring the nation back online.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a question to chew on, straight from the text's core warning. If modern state resilience relies entirely on intertwined infrastructure, our power grids, our food supply chains, our digital communications, how incredibly vulnerable is that whole system to deep, localized political polarization?
This briefing definitely forces us to look past the Hollywood versions of historical warfare and deeply reflect on the absolute fragility of our highly connected, deeply divided modern systems, right? Take some time to think about that. Thanks for hanging out with me for this deep dive. Stay curious, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.